The first time I ever set foot on the deck of the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater was in October of 1986. Pumpkin sail. The first pumpkin sail I was ever on, and I had so much fun. I came back for the next one and the next one and a bunch of ones after that. And it's been such a joy to be a part of the wider Clearwater community. That's not, however, the first time I set foot on a boat. First time I set foot on a boat, I was probably being carried by somebody. It was down at the Cape. We'd go fishing, especially in the rain as I got older, because it gave my parents time to be alone in the cottage, and we were out with my grandparents fishing. That was my mom's parents. And then later on, my dad's dad, Grant Bates, he semi-retired. He was a salesman, and he just sold less things over a shorter amount of area. And since he wasn't so busy selling, he decided to buy a lobster boat. And he would go out on the boat exploring the coast of Maine around New Harbor where he lived. And he also would row out to the boat where it was anchored in the middle of the harbor in his skiff. He'd tie up, he'd get in, and he'd take out his folding lawn chair and sit in the stern of the boat and watch everybody else work. He liked doing that. And when we go up there, we go out on picnics. We go fishing too, for flounder, tautog, cod, mackerel. But I like the picnics even more. We'd go to Cranberry Island, Monhegan Island, and also an island that was only an island at low tide, Seal Island. And we'd go out there and we'd anchor. And we'd have a picnic lunch and we'd watch the seals, they'd watch us. I don't really ever noticed about seals. There's something about their eyes. They would swim over to us, and then they do this thing where they kind of tread water. They go vertical in the water and use their fins to keep themselves steady, and then they stretch their necks up and they look at you like they're thinking about something. Maybe that's why I wasn't surprised about Selkie stories. Stories about seals. I found a book. I love, going into bookstores and looking at titles and said, is that a good book? And I saw this book, The People of the Sea. And I took it out, and it was a wonderful book, still is. A man wrote it who worked for BBC radio and television. He'd take vacations. He loved going out in the islands off the coast of Ireland and Scotland and collecting seal stories. Each chapter in the book was a different place where he visited, and it would talk about who met him and where they went to hear the story. And I remember one chapter where they were sitting in a croft with a peat fire, and there was a loft where the kids were supposed to be asleep, but all of them were peeking through the banisters, listening to the story, and the adults were making a mind not to look up because they'd have to tell the kids to go to bed, and they wanted them to hear the story. And this one story I liked a lot. It was about a woman, her husband, and their son. Now, the woman, her husband was a seal killer. That's how he made his living. He'd hunt seals along the coast with a knife, not in a boat, but along the shore. He'd see a seal, sneak up on it, grab it, kill it, and then he'd bring it home, skin it, and they'd use the meat, they'd use the blubber and the fat for oil to make candles, and they'd use the skin to make things like shoes, purses, clothing. And one day he was out hunting, and his wife, the mother, was out working in the garden. It was the time of year for spreading seaweed. They'd get kelp from the shore. They'd bring it up. The soil was so bad there, and they'd spread it over the beds for the winter and then dig it in spring. And she was spreading the kelp, and her toddler was out with her, not helping her working. He was practicing his walking. You know how toddlers are. When they first start to walk, they'll take 3 steps, and then they'll start to lose their balance, and they'd almost fall over, and then they get their balance and take 3 more steps or so. Sometimes fall on their butt, laugh, get up again. Well, she remembered she had to do something inside. And the outside, they had this fence that went all the way around the house, a gate in the front that led to the path that went down to the village and the harbor, and a gate in the back that led to the path that went down to the shore. So it was like a giant playpen. The worst he could do was get in the seaweed. And she went inside to do some things that she remembered and left him outside to practice his walking. It took her longer to get out than she thought it would. And when she got out, she looked and he wasn't near the garden. And she went around the house, couldn't see him anywhere. And then she noticed that the gate to the path down to the ocean was open. And she went to look, and there was his footprint in the mud by the gate, and she saw his prints going over to the path. She followed the prints to the path and then down the path and down to the shore, and she saw the prints going along the beach, getting closer and closer to the water, and then they were right at the water, and the waves, gentle waves, were washing up and lapping away the footprints. She couldn't see her son anywhere. And then she did what a lot of moms would do, a lot of dads too. She just knelt down in the sand. She cried. She cried so hard. I don't know if you ever cried this way, where you're crying, and all of a sudden you don't have any more breath to cry. And you have to stop to take in a deep breath, and that's what she did. She stopped, took in this deep breath, and in the silence that followed her crying, she heard another crying coming from the end of the beach. Beyond the end of the beach, there was a pile of rocks there and a little cove, and she knew that cove. She went over, following the cry, and she climbed up and she looked down in the cove, and there on the beach was a mother seal, 2 pups, and her son. And she ran down and she grabbed her son. She held him tight, just tight enough so he'd know how glad she was to see him. And she looked down at the mother seal, and the mother seal nodded, gave a little bark, and slipped off into the water. And the pups followed her. Well, that night, she told her husband the story of what had happened as they're sitting around dinner. And when he'd been hunting and hadn't caught anything, he used his knife at dinner time. And when he heard the story, he looked down at the knife. He picked it up. He got up from where he was sitting, and he went over and he opened a drawer and he put in the knife and closed it. And he never hunted seals again. Well, that's the story from Scotland. And if you find that book, The People of the Sea, there's a lot of great stories in it. Hope you tell one to somebody. Thanks.